The air was thick with the heat of a late summer afternoon. I stood by the window, staring out at the cloudless sky. The sun was relentless, casting harsh shadows over the cracked driveway and the withering lawn. I needed someone to fix the place up, but finding a reliable handyman had proven to be more difficult than I expected. The house wasn't in terrible condition, but it had seen better days. My husband, Mark, and I bought it a few years ago, imagining it as our forever home. We'd been married for nearly 10 years and things had started out great. But over the past couple of years, everything had shifted. There were moments when I couldn't even recognize the man I had once been so madly in love with. Mark was distant now, always busy with work or on his phone. He was constantly distracted, barely looking up when I tried to talk to him. I'd catch glimpses of texts he would quickly swipe away, phone calls he'd step outside to take. Something was off. Deep down, I knew it, but I wasn't ready to face it. I wasn't ready to confront the possibility that Mark was cheating on me. I sighed, pulling myself out of my thoughts as I heard the doorbell ring. I wasn't expecting anyone, but it must have been the handyman I had hired to help with the repairs. His name was Alex, and we had exchanged a few messages on Reddit, where he advertised his services. He had good reviews, and since I'd been feeling so overwhelmed by the state of the house and the state of my marriage, I figured having someone come in and take care of things would relieve at least some of the pressure. I opened the door, and there he was. Alex, he was tall, lean but muscular, with dirty blonde hair and a casual smile that didn't quite meet his eyes. He was attractive in that rugged, hands-on way, probably in his early 30s, just a few years younger than me. I was struck by how much confidence he exuded, carrying a toolbox and wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans that seemed to fit him too well. "Hi, you must be Alex," I said, offering a polite smile. "That's me," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "You must be Emma." "Yeah, thanks for coming by," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. "No problem at all." In tall, "I've got the list of things you need fixed, shouldn't be a problem," he said, glancing around the living room with a professional air, though his eyes lingered a bit too long on me. I tried not to think anything of it. He was just being friendly, right? But there was something in his gaze, something that made my skin tingle, and not in a good way. It felt invasive, like he was seeing more than just the clutter of a neglected house. I pushed the thought aside and led him through the house, showing him the areas that needed work: the leaky faucet in the kitchen, the door that wouldn't shut properly, and a few other odds and ends. As he worked, I busied myself with other things, trying to avoid hovering. But every now and then, I found myself wandering into the same room where Alex was. He worked quickly and efficiently, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was somehow too much. He'd flash that casual smile, and his gaze would seem to linger on me a moment longer than necessary. By the time he finished for the day, the sun had started to set, casting an orange glow through the windows. I paid him for his time and thanked him for the help, but as he was about to leave, he paused, standing in the doorway. "You know, I'll need to come back tomorrow to finish a couple of things," he said, his voice lowering slightly. I hadn't expected that, but it made sense. I nodded, smiling. "Yeah, of course. Just let me know what time works for you." He tilted his head, his eyes locking onto mine. "How about I come by earlier, say, around 8? There was something in the way he asked, almost like he was testing the boundaries, pushing to see how I'd respond. But I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. He was just being professional, right? "Sure, that works," I said, keeping my tone light. He gave a slow nod, still holding my gaze, before finally turning and heading out the door. I watched him leave, my stomach twisting slightly in discomfort, but I brushed it off. I was just being paranoid. Everything was fine. The next morning, Alex arrived promptly at 8, as promised. This time, though, his demeanor seemed a little different. He wasn't unfriendly, but there was an air of familiarity that hadn't been there the day before. He moved around the house as if he owned the place, his eyes following me a bit too closely as I went about my morning routine. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my tasks for the day. Mark had left early for work, as usual, and I was alone with Alex. I told myself it was silly to feel uncomfortable in my own home, but something about his presence unsettled me. At one point, I was in the kitchen making coffee when Alex appeared in the doorway. His eyes were sharp, focused intently on me. "You seem tense," he said, his voice smooth and almost predatory. I forced a smile, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "Just a little stressed, I guess." He stepped closer, too close for comfort, and I instinctively backed away, but the kitchen counter was behind me, trapping me in place. "You know," he said slowly, his voice lowering to a near whisper, "I could help with that." I blinked, confused and alarmed. "What do you mean?" His eyes darkened, and he moved even closer, his hand reaching out to touch my arm. I flinched, but he didn't stop. "Come on, Emma," he said, his tone almost condescending. "You know exactly what I mean." Panic surged through me as the full weight of his words hit me. I tried to pull away, but he tightened his grip on my arm, his expression hardening. "I've seen the way you've been looking at me," he said, his voice growing more aggressive. "You've been leading me on." I shook my head, my voice shaking. "No, I haven't, I never." Alex straightened his shirt, his expression cold and detached, as if nothing had happened. "I don't bother telling anyone," he said casually, grabbing his toolbox and heading toward the door. "No one will believe you. You asked for this." And with that, he was gone, leaving me standing there, numb and broken. The days that followed were a blur. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't know how. Who would believe me? A married woman, alone with a handyman, of course. People would think I had led him on. It didn't matter that it wasn't true. In this world, perception was everything. I tried to act normal, to go about my life as if nothing had changed, but inside I was crumbling. Mark didn't notice, of course. He was too wrapped up in his own world to see the cracks forming in mine. But I couldn't stay silent forever. One night, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through Reddit, trying to escape my own thoughts, when I stumbled across a post. It was in a subreddit dedicated to relationship advice, and the title caught my eye. "I think my wife is cheating on me with the handyman. What do I do?" My heart stopped. I clicked on the post, my hands trembling as I read the words. "My wife hired this handyman a few weeks ago to do some repairs around the house. At first, I didn't think much of it, but lately I've noticed some strange things. She's been acting distant, and I've caught her looking at him a little too closely. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I think something might be going on between them. Should I confront her?" The username wasn't Mark's, but I knew it was him. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt like the walls were closing in around me. He thought I was cheating on him with Alex. I wanted to scream, to throw my phone across the room, but I couldn't. Instead, I sat there staring at the screen, numb with disbelief. I didn't know what to do. If I told Mark the truth, would he even believe me? Or would he think I was just trying to cover up an affair? The thought of confessing what had happened reliving that nightmare was unbearable. I closed the Reddit app and tossed my phone aside, curling up on the couch as silent tears slipped down my cheeks. I felt trapped in my own life, suffocated by secrets and lies. The betrayal wasn't just in what Alex had done to me, it was in the fact that my own husband didn't trust me. The man I had loved for so long, the man I had built a life with, thought I was capable of cheating on him, and maybe, in some twisted way, that hurt even more than what Alex had done. I spent the next few days in a daze, unsure of how to move forward. I couldn't go to the police. What proof did I have? It would be his word against mine, and I knew how that would turn out. I couldn't tell Mark, either. The damage was already done. I felt utterly alone, trapped in a situation I couldn't escape. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Alex's face, heard his voice telling me that I had asked for it, that I had wanted it. I couldn't shake the feeling of his hands on me, the weight of his body pinning me down. The worst part was that deep down, a small part of me almost believed him. Had I done something to encourage him? Had I smiled too much? Laughed at his jokes when I should have been more reserved? Had I somehow given him the impression that I was interested, even though I wasn't? The guilt ate away at me, mixing with the fear and the shame, until I didn't know what to feel anymore. Then, one evening, Mark came home from work, his face tense and unreadable. He didn't say a word as he walked through the door, dropping his bag on the floor and heading straight for the kitchen. I watched him from the living room, my heart racing, knowing that something was wrong. He came back a few minutes later, holding his phone in his hand. He sat down across from me, his eyes locked onto mine with a cold intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "I know," he said quietly. I froze, my blood running cold. "I know about you and the handyman," he continued, his voice steady but filled with a simmering rage. "I know what you've been doing." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Panic surged through me as I realized he had made up his mind. There was no convincing him otherwise. "Mark, it's not what you think," I finally managed to say, my voice shaking. "Don't lie to me, Emma," he snapped, his eyes narrowing. "I've seen the way you look at him. I've seen the texts." I blinked, confused. "What texts?" He held up his phone, showing me a series of messages exchanged between Alex and me. But they weren't the messages I remembered. These ones were different, suggestive, flirtatious, implicating me in ways I hadn't expected. My stomach dropped as I realized what had happened. Alex had somehow manipulated the conversation, twisting my words to make it seem like I had been leading him on, like I had wanted this. It was all a lie. But how could I prove it? Mark stood up, his face twisted with anger and betrayal. "I can't believe you would do this to me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "After everything we've been through." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I didn't know what to say. How could I explain something that sounded so unbelievable? How could I convince him that I wasn't the one who had betrayed him? "I didn't cheat on you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But it didn't matter. Mark had already made up his mind. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the house, leaving me alone in the wreckage of what had once been our life together. As I sat there, tears streaming down my face, I realized that in one fell swoop I had lost everything. The man who had violated me was gone, but the scars he had left behind would never heal. And the man I had loved, the man I had trusted, had been taken from me by lies and deceit. I had been forced into a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from, and there was no escape. I was truly, utterly alone. Days passed in a haze, and I couldn't remember a time when the house felt so empty. The silence was suffocating. Mark didn't come back, and the texts stopped coming. He had moved out, taking only a few essentials, but leaving a void in my life that was impossible to ignore. I hadn't heard from him since that night, and I couldn't even bring myself to try calling him. What could I say that would make him believe me now? The seeds of doubt Alex had planted had already grown into a forest of mistrust. I couldn't help but wonder how it all had fallen apart so quickly. One moment, I had been living in what I thought was a stable, albeit distant marriage, and the next, I was left questioning everything. Alex had orchestrated something far darker than I could have imagined, and now I was caught in a web of lies that I couldn't untangle. I avoided the places that reminded me of what had happened, like the kitchen where he had cornered me, or the front door where he'd walked out like nothing ever happened. I barely ate. Sleep was a distant memory. I lay awake at night, running through every detail of that day, over and over again. Maybe there was something I could have done to stop it. Maybe I should have been more careful, more aware of the signs. My mind refused to let go of the guilt, even though deep down, I knew I wasn't the one to blame. Then came the messages. It started a week after Mark left. At first, it was just a single Reddit notification. Someone had replied to a post I had made months ago about a home improvement project. When I clicked on it, the words felt like a punch to the gut. "So, how's your handyman doing? Heard you two were getting close." I stared at the screen in disbelief. My fingers trembled as I exited out of the app, my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be. It was just a coincidence, right? Just someone being flippant about a random post. But then more messages followed. Private messages from accounts I didn't recognize, filled with innuendos, accusations, and vile remarks. They accused me of being a cheater, of having some torrid affair with Alex, some of them, seemed to know intimate details about my life, details no one outside my home should have known. And worst of all, there were comments about Mark, questioning whether I had ever loved him or if I had just been using him as a cover for my real relationship with Alex. It became clear that someone had shared the story. Alex. I sat in disbelief as the realization dawned on me. Alex had posted about what happened, but he had twisted the narrative, just like he'd done with the fake texts. He had painted me as a willing participant in this horrific ordeal. He had made me out to be the villain, the unfaithful wife. And now, strangers on the internet were buying into his lies. The comments started to pile up, and soon I couldn't escape the barrage of hateful messages. It wasn't just Reddit anymore, it spread to other platforms, places I hadn't even known I was vulnerable. Someone had found my Instagram, and there were comments under my photos mocking me, accusing me of being a liar and a cheat. My personal life had been ripped apart for everyone to see, and I had no way of stopping it. I tried reporting the messages, blocking the accounts, but new ones popped up just as quickly as I shut them down. It was relentless. And with each new notification, I felt myself sink deeper into a hole I couldn't climb out of. I thought about going to the police, about trying to explain what Alex had done not just to me, but how he was weaponizing social media against me. But what could I say? That a handyman I had hired through Reddit had attacked me, lied about it, and now people online were harassing me. It sounded unbelievable, and I knew that without concrete evidence, no one would take me seriously. Worse still, I couldn't shake the paranoia. What if Alex had taken pictures that day? What if there was something else out there that he could use against me? It seemed like the kind of thing he'd do, the kind of control he wanted to exert. I was trapped in a cycle of fear, afraid of what he might do next, and terrified of how many people believed his lies. Then, one night, as I lay on the couch staring blankly at my phone, another notification popped up. This one, however, wasn't from a stranger. It was from Mark. The message was short, but it felt like a lifeline. We need to talk. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the screen, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to jump at the chance to explain everything, to pour out the truth and hope that he would finally believe me. But another part of me, the part that had been broken by betrayal and fear, didn't know if I could handle it. What if he didn't believe me? What if he had already made up his mind? But I couldn't avoid him forever. If there was any chance of salvaging what was left of our marriage, I had to face him. I typed out a quick reply, agreeing to meet him at a cafe near our house the next day. When the time came, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. I arrived at the cafe early, sitting at a corner table where I could see the door. My hands were clammy, and I couldn't stop fidgeting with the edge of my napkin as I waited. When Mark finally walked in, I felt a surge of emotions: relief, fear, anger, and longing all tangled together. He looked the same, but there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He sat down across from me, and for a moment, we just stared at each other in silence. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he said quietly, his voice strained. "Everything's so messed up." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I didn't cheat on you, Mark," I said, my voice trembling. "What happened with Alex? He forced me. I didn't have a choice." He shook his head, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "But the messages, Emma, the texts, they're there. They're real." "They're not real," I insisted, my voice rising in desperation. "He faked them, or he edited them. I don't know how, but I swear to you, I never sent those texts." Mark stared at me, his expression unreadable. "I don't know if I can trust you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the tears welling up in my eyes. "Please, Mark, you have to believe me. I would never do this to you. I love you." He closed his eyes, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. "I want to believe you," he said softly. "I really do. But this whole thing, it's just too much. I don't know what to think anymore." We sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of everything hanging between us. I wanted to reach out to him, to hold his hand and tell him that everything would be okay, but I couldn't, because I wasn't sure if it would be. Finally, Mark stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "I need time," he said, his voice hollow. "I need to figure out what's real and what's not. I need to figure out if I can trust you again." My heart ached as I watched him turn and walk away, leaving me alone at the table. The tears I had been holding back finally spilled over, and I buried my face in my hands, sobbing quietly. I didn't know if Mark would ever believe me. I didn't know if we could ever repair the damage that had been done. But one thing was certain: Alex had taken something from me that I could never get back. He had stolen my sense of safety, my peace of mind, and my marriage. And now I had to figure out how to rebuild my life from the wreckage he had left behind. I wasn't sure if I could,